The story begins in the South China Sea during a storm, where Captain John Finnegan and his small crew, engineer Joey Pantucci and assistant Layla, set out to sea on their own boat, the Saipan. Layla was working on deck and complaining to the captain when suddenly their passengers boarded. They were transporting a group of armed mercenaries led by their commander, Hanover. Captain Finnegan sticks to the rule of not asking unnecessary questions as long as he's getting paid, and simply follows the route. Meanwhile, the luxury liner Argonautica sets out on its maiden voyage. A lavish party is underway on board, where everything is included. The wealthy are gambling, and expensive drinks and food are being served to them. Suddenly, amid the noise, Simon Canton, a millionaire and the event's organizer who built the liner, asks for a moment of attention. He gives a speech and joyfully proposes a toast to the Argonautica. On board the liner is a formidable woman, the professional thief Trillian St. James. She deliberately bumped into the ship's captain, discreetly stealing his wallet, which contained what they needed, an access key card. She threw the wallet overboard. Meanwhile, aboard the Saipan, the crew of Thieves was having a hard time with the voyage. T-Ray complained of seasickness, and suddenly he and Mamoli nearly came to blows. Suddenly, the mechanic Pantucci overheard their conversation. He went into the luggage compartment, opened a crate, and discovered that the gang was carrying torpedoes. As soon as one of the gang members, Vivo, noticed him, he brought the mechanic to his colleagues, and they beat Pantucci up. Layla heard this and wanted to help. Finnegan was afraid to confront the dangerous gang, but he mustered his courage, walked in on them with a harpoon, and warned that if they killed their mechanic, things would go badly. The gang wanted to get rid of the mechanic and was beating him when suddenly the captain struck one of the gang members, showing that he meant business. The gang pointed their weapons at him, but eventually the gang leader, Hanover, settled the conflict and ordered them to let the mechanic go. Meanwhile, on the liner, Trillian managed to sneak into the security room. Using chewing gum, she covered the surveillance camera and swiped the access card at the entrance to the vault containing the jewels belonging to the liner's wealthy passengers. The woman had already tried on a precious necklace when suddenly the crew members and Simon Canton himself caught her red-handed. They had received a fax stating that the woman was wanted for making threats and was on the wanted list in 4 countries. The guardhouse on the new ship had not yet been completed, so in the end they decided to lock her in the storeroom. Trillian discreetly stole millionaire Canton's wallet and found something to keep herself occupied in the storeroom by sampling the food and drinks. Meanwhile, Layla was stitching up Pantucci's wound. The mechanic was telling the crew about the torpedoes they'd spotted. The closer they got to their destination, the more heavily armed the gang of criminals became. Meanwhile, in the operations room, an unknown individual uploaded virus files and completely disrupted the liner's systems, shutting down the engines and the steering mechanism. The crew on the liner lost the signal. The central computer failed and they were unable to connect an alternative power source. Mr. Canton was getting nervous when suddenly one of the crew members spotted something large on the radar, approaching from a depth of 160 meters straight toward the liner. While the passengers were having fun and had no idea what was going on, an unknown creature swam up to the liner and crashed straight into the hull, causing total chaos inside. People ran in all directions. One woman ran into the restroom and locked herself in. But that was a big mistake. Tentacles dragged her right out of the toilet. The storm continued. The gang members began smashing parts of the ship to mount a torpedo launcher there. Suddenly, the captain saw on the radar that they were approaching some object. It was a motorboat that had broken away from the liner during the chaos. The ship crashed into it and there was an explosion. A hole opened up in the bow. Pantucci put out the fire and reported to the captain that what they had crashed into was a motorboat. This surprised Finnegan. A motorboat so far from land. They were running out of fuel in half an hour at most. They would run out of power. Suddenly, Layla spotted a liner. The engineers snatched her binoculars to confirm it. They thought they might be able to borrow some fuel from them, but the gang members pointed their weapons at the crew and admitted that their goal was to rob this wealthy liner. Hanover ordered Finnegan to follow his instructions and sail closer to the liner. They wondered why the liner was stationary, but they began their operation anyway, broke open a hatch, and the gang members, along with the mechanic and the captain, went inside, while Layla stayed behind with one of the mercenaries, Billy. They moved quickly through the liner's corridors when suddenly, upon entering the atrium, they discovered that everything around them was in disarray and not a single person was in sight. Everything was covered in blood. Suddenly, the sound of an elevator rising toward them caught their attention, but it was empty inside. The lifeboats were in their places, and the criminals couldn't figure out where everyone had gone. They rushed into the casino area. Upon hearing a noise, the thieves opened fire haphazardly across the room, managing to pocket a couple of dollars from the table. Meanwhile, in the storeroom, Trillian came to her senses. She was startled by suspicious sounds coming from the pipes. She took out a lockpick and used it to reach the wires, which opened the door. The thieves entered the main control room. There was no one there either. Meanwhile, on the Saipan motorboat, Layla was trying to fix the fuel tank. She heard suspicious noises but continued working with the gas torch. Suddenly, the body of a dead man surfaced from the water, startling Layla. She was examining it when all of a sudden an unknown creature swam up behind her and dragged her into the depths of the sea through a hole in the boat. T-Ray and Mamuri took the captain and the engineer to the engine room so they could check what was wrong with the liner. Suddenly, T-Ray heard something and went out on his own into the corridor, which was half flooded. Sounds resembling human breathing could be heard, so T-Ray called out thinking someone was there. Suddenly, hoses fell on him from above, startling him. He continued through the engine room and heard sounds like a growl. Something was sitting in the water. Suddenly, T-Ray was pulled into the water. The others in the engine room heard screams. Meanwhile, Trillian had entered the jewelry vault, attempting to rob it for the second time. However, this time she was stopped by a gang of thieves. Hanover was surprised that signs of life had finally appeared on this cruise ship. Trillian tried to pass herself off as a crew member. While Hanover was trying to figure out what had happened on the liner, Vivo took the key card and tried to enter the vault. However, as soon as the door opened, an axe flew into his head. It was Simon Canton. The rest of the mercenaries opened fire on those inside the vault, and only Canton and the ship's captain survived. In the chaos, Trillian managed to escape. Radio communication was poor, but Mamuri in the engine room was trying to inform Hanover of T-Ray's death. Mamuri was extremely nervous and denied the existence of any sea creatures on the liner. But suddenly, something attacked him from the water and dragged him across the room. Finnegan drew his weapon and the mechanic grabbed some spare parts. It was time to flee the engine room. Finnegan tried to shoot at the creature, but it was swimming right through the metal floor, so they ran. Trillian ran into the elevator, but instead of going up, the elevator went down toward the engine room. She saw Pantucci and instinctively struck him. Finnegan dragged the woman back into the elevator and they went up. Sounds of some kind of creature could be heard from the elevator shaft. When the doors opened, a gang of criminals was waiting for them. Finnegan agreed to lower his weapon and tried to explain that the mercenaries had been killed by some kind of creature. Canton confirmed the existence of unknown creatures, claiming that the liner was swarming with them. Together, they rode the elevator up and down repeatedly as the creature was interfering with its operation. Suddenly, the cables snapped and they plummeted downward. The floor was covered in blood and the remains of the ship's passengers' bones lay scattered around them. The metal doors and walls had bulged and warped from the creature's movements. Hanover and Finnegan moved closer to investigate, but the creature began to thrash about even more violently, so they fled. Meanwhile, on the Saipan motorboat, the mercenary Billy, still unaware of what was happening, went down to check on Layla. He didn't find her, but he too was attacked by some unknown entity. The liner's captain explained that it all happened because someone had disabled the radio communication system. Finnegan immediately put the pieces together. He believed that it was millionaire Simon Canton who had disabled the system so that the mercenaries could steal the jewels from the liner's wealthy passengers. In other words, he was an accomplice of Hanover, and his suspicions proved correct. Hanover quickly confessed. Now, the entire gang demanded that Canton fix the system, but that was impossible. He had disabled it permanently. His plan was to steal the jewels and, after the passengers were evacuated, sink the liner and collect the money from the insurance company. While the men were arguing among themselves, Trillian stole a gun. Only Finnegan noticed. Suddenly, Pantucci noticed something dripping on him from above. There was a terrifying monster up there. Finnegan opened fire on it, and the monster spat out a man. The gang realized it wasn't just a passenger, it was their colleague Billy, barely alive. They all shot the monster together and went their separate ways. Finnegan ran into Trillian, and she asked him to take her with him on his boat. Suddenly, the monster attacked them. The woman ran away while the monster was turning the levers in the hallway. Finnegan tried to grab his weapon, but the monster cornered him until Trillian attacked it from behind just in time and saved Finnegan. He thanked her and agreed to take her onto the boat. Meanwhile, the liner's captain was attacked by a monster, and Canton hesitated to lend him a hand. Finnegan ran over and tried to help, but to no avail. The gang shot at the monster, but it still dragged the captain away. They wondered what kind of monster it was, and Canton believed it was a creature from the Otto family, a sea worm. Those living at a depth of 6,000 meters can feed on adult sharks, and those living at depths of 9,000 and 12,000 meters are probably even worse. Finnegan declared that he'd had enough of the lectures. He intended to get out of there as quickly as possible by motorboat. Suddenly, as they were walking through the corridors looking for a way upstairs, the lights went out. They were surrounded by flammable pipes. The door leading upstairs was jammed, so they needed a different plan. The only alternative route was to go down below deck and climb up through the hatches from there. However, the passage was flooded. The distance was about 20 meters. Finnegan agreed to go and scout the situation, but only on the condition that Hanover swim with him. He would fire 2 shots to signal if the path was safe. The Finnegan, Hanover, and the mercenary Mulligan dove in. On the way, Mulligan came across someone's hand, which scared him, and he barely managed to escape. While the others were waiting for the signal, they suddenly heard the monster's sounds. It was moving down the corridor, even though Pantucci had slammed the door shut in front of it. But there was little time left. They had to dive. Canton went first, the others stayed behind and fired at the monster, but eventually they dove in one by one after him. The mercenary Mason jumped in last and was attacked by the monster. The rest managed to swim to the surface. They won't start searching for the liner for at least another day, so there's no point in hoping for a rescue mission. They were now in the galley area, one floor above. Mulligan panicked and wanted to stay there, waiting for rescuers. Finnegan said he wasn't going to wait and wanted to keep going, but Mulligan wouldn't let him, threatening him with his weapon. Hanover didn't want to stay there either, so he argued with his colleague. Trillian pointed out that the ship might not even last a full day since it was already starting to sink little by little. Suddenly, everyone froze. There was a monster behind Mulligan. He reacted in time and shot the monster, but it was in vain. The monster attacked him from the other side, and in the end, Mulligan became yet another snack. The rest moved down the hallway, but monsters blocked their path. Canton tricked the crew by pointing them in the wrong direction, while he himself, before anyone noticed, turned the other way. The group eventually reached the room of the horrific feast, where the remains of all the liner's passengers lay. Monsters were breaking through the hull, and water began pouring in. The group ran back, and upon catching up to Canton, Finnegan shouted after him. Hanover and Pantucci threw a grenade at the monster. A new problem arose. Finnegan had lost his backpack containing the spare parts needed to repair his boat. Without them, escaping from here would be impossible. As Hanover and Pantucci ran through the flooded corridor, Hanover shot Pantucci in the leg to use him as bait and hold off the monster. However, Pantucci got lucky. He jumped into a small service elevator nearby and escaped death. When Canton ran outside, he saw that the liner was indeed sinking rapidly, but suddenly he spotted an island. Finnegan and Trillian also saw the island and ran toward the motorboat. The woman laughed at Finnegan's boat, calling it a pile of scrap metal, but they had no other choice. Meanwhile, Pantucci limped his way to the casino and found a pistol there. Suddenly, Hanover grabbed him by the shoulder. He didn't say a word. A monster was devouring him right then and there. Hanover's eyes pleaded for help. Pantucci turned back and handed him the pistol. But Hanover fired right next to Pantucci. In desperation, he wanted to turn the gun on himself, but as it turned out, the bullet he'd just fired was the last one. Finnegan was already on his boat while Trillian went to check if there was any fuel left on the liner and to find the keys to the jet skis, which were in one of the compartments. Suddenly, Pantucci came onto the boat and was shocked to hear that Finnegan had lost the spare parts. Eventually, they learned that Layla was no longer with them. Pantucci repaired the boat while mourning the girl. Finnegan's main plan was to use the loaded torpedoes to guide them toward the liner and destroy it, while they themselves would escape on the jet skis that were on the liner. They tried to start the boat, and after several attempts, they finally succeeded. When Trillian found the keys to the jet skis, Canton suddenly walked into the room. He threatened her, trying to take the keys away, and fired a signal pistol. But Trillian started to run away. Finnegan heard this and couldn't leave her there, so he ordered Pantucci to silence the boat and ran after Trillian. Canton fired again, but missed. Finnegan wandered through the corridors, searching for the girl. Eventually, Canton caught up with Trillian and threatened her. She handed him the keys, but he couldn't leave a witness who knew the whole truth about him. Suddenly, Finnegan entered the room and Canton had to flee. The monster became active again, and everything around them began to shake. The monster appeared in all its glory right in the middle of the atrium. One of its tentacles grabbed Finnegan, and his weapon fell from his hands. When the monster lifted the man close to it, Finnegan pulled out a second weapon he had strapped to his back and fired directly into the monster's eye. Finnegan shouted at the girl to run to the cargo hold as fast as she could. Finnegan ran toward the boat, but Pantucci was no longer there. All that remained were the monster's tracks and the cap Pantucci had left behind. The captain was in despair. Finnegan went to the cargo hold to find Trillian. She was so frightened she nearly shot him. Meanwhile, Canton spotted the running speedboat and jumped onto it, breaking his leg in the process. Finnegan and Trillian got on the jet ski together and fired back at the monster, chasing them as they sped away. The speedboat was rigged to detonate explosives. Canton hobbled over to the control panel, but by the time he realized what was happening, it was too late, and an explosion rocked the ship, blowing up the liner along with the monster. At the last moment, Finnegan and Trillian managed to make their way through the corridors to a hatch and escape the liner. At dawn, they reached the island, and all that remained of the liner was a decorative lifebuoy. Suddenly, Trillian kissed Finnegan, and that wasn't even the most unexpected thing. Suddenly, Pantucci swam up from the water. He had been washed ashore. As it turned out, the monster had smashed through the glass and was about to attack Pantucci, but he had jumped out through the hatch. However, the lull didn't last long. A mighty roar from an unknown creature echoed from deep within the jungle, and trees began to fall under the weight of something massive. It seems their fight for survival wasn't over yet. Thanks for watching. What do you think happened to them on the island? Share your thoughts on this movie in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the Movie Fist channel so you don't miss out on interesting movie plots.